At CDA, you do a lot of advisory work with companies in fragile and conflict affected countries. So, from your experience and your perspective, what role can the business sector actually play in peace building efforts? And what would be the difference between regular business conduct and the one that is needed for peace building?
There's very little evidence that supports the idea that in countries that are affected by conflict and fragility, routine business operations drive peace or diminish conflict. And operations that are ethical and responsible are not an exception to this. It's important to note in this connection that standards of good practice do not in themselves guide companies to operational approaches that are conflict sensitive. In our advisory work with companies at CDA, we frequently see responsible and ethical business operations that nevertheless trigger, drive, or sustain conflict. And to our knowledge, very few companies understand how to operate in a conflict-sensitive manner. This underlying reality suggests that the question itself may need to be reframed a little bit. A more constructive question to ask about business conduct might be, how can conflict-sensitive practices be mainstreamed, so to speak, among companies operating in fragile and conflict-affected states? Now, nothing of what I've just said speaks directly to the role of companies in peace-building efforts, however. And there is some evidence that indicates that actors within the private sector do, in some instances, play effective roles within peace efforts. The evidence is pretty clear, though, that they do this when they facilitate, catalyze, or support the efforts of other actors to address conflict issues directly. And in almost all cases, certainly all that we've ever seen, these activities are outside the scope of routine business activity. And cases in which companies undertake such courses of action are quite rare. In cases where we found companies deliberately working with others to build peace, the overwhelming majority of other companies in the context, including companies in the same industries, were not undertaking similar actions.
Thank you for these insights, Ben. I would like to follow up on your point that very few businesses, even if they are responsible and ethical, know how to operate in a conflict sensitive manner, and that the real question is how conflict sensitive practices can be mainstreamed among companies operating in fragile and conflict affected settings. So, why is, for example, the do no harm approach insufficient to contribute to peace building? And is it not more than one could actually expect from the business sector? And in the end, would you say that economic perspectives and local job creation are still better than nothing?
In this context, the phrase do no harm might be used to refer to two approaches that are actually fundamentally different. The first of these we might characterize as harm avoidance, which is an approach to business operations and investment that's focused on avoiding harms. A harm in this context might be something like human rights abuses or environmental pollution or adverse effects on livelihoods and quality of life or any other similar bad outcome. Standards of responsible business, including the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights and the IFC performance standards, tend to orient companies towards harm avoidance. Our experience working in the field with companies, however, indicates convincingly that harm avoidance approaches and implementation of standards of responsible business conduct are ineffective conflict management approaches. And it strikes me as self-evident that in a context that's already affected by conflict, avoiding harm is not in itself a way to build peace or to resolve conflict. The second of the do no harms that the question might be referring to is a framework for conflict sensitivity in humanitarian and development operations that was developed by CDA. CDA and International Alert have also developed similar tools and frameworks that are designed specifically for companies. These are tools that are designed for the purpose of conflict mitigation. That is their aim and their goal. One of the things that CDA's Do No Harm project demonstrated and supported with abundant evidence is that well-intentioned interventions, even interventions that are successful in their own terms, have adverse, unintended impacts upon conflict unless deliberate efforts are undertaken to manage those impacts. Whether you're a company, a humanitarian agency, or an NGO, if you aren't conflict sensitive in a fragile and conflict-affected state, there's a high likelihood that you're contributing in some way to conflict. And our experience in the field with companies suggests that the norm when new resources like jobs contracts and so on are introduced into a conflict-affected setting is that they become part of the conflict, which is to say, people fight over them. So if you're asking whether job creation initiatives are better than nothing, the answer is not always, and certainly not if they aren't conflict sensitive.
Thank you, Ben. So, what I'm understanding from your answer is that companies would have to make a lot of effort to change their business conduct in order to not contribute to the conflict drivers or to not impact the conflict setting in any way. So, that just sort of makes me wonder, based on your experience, what would motivate a company to still engage in a collaborative process with peace as the goal? And could you give us some insights for approaching a company on that level?
It's important to bear in mind that companies' mandate is to generate profits through a primary business activity. Their core activities are those that drive profits, whether the company's business involves producing beverages, extracting oil and gas from the ground, or something else. Other things that they do are ancillary to those core activities, and many companies contract them out completely to other companies. Companies themselves are likely to see their own roles in the context where they operate as being defined by those core activities. So in light of that, it may not be surprising at all that our own research as CDA suggests that companies enter into collaborative processes that have peace as the goal when they see that the presence of conflict or the absence of peace prevents them from engaging in their core business activities. And it's important to point out that this is a much, much higher threshold than simply being exposed to conflict or security risks. And the fact that it's a higher threshold can be seen in the number of companies that operate in places like Myanmar, the DRC, and Libya, and so on, without engaging in any purposeful efforts to address conflict directly. Whether a company might consider engaging in a collaborative process aimed at peace is something that can really only be addressed on a case-by-case basis, and any number of factors may be relevant. The company itself, the context of conflict and the conflict dynamics, host state laws, regulations, and the state's contract with the company, which may impose very tight limits on the company in terms of what it's allowed to do, the nature of the other actors that are engaged in the initiative, and so on. There's an enormous amount to say about this subject, but let me limit myself here to 2 points. First, companies tend to be most effective when they catalyze other actors, facilitate processes involving other actors, or convene other actors. Many companies may not see it as appropriate to be at the center of such initiatives, and they might be more likely to participate when they can take on roles that are peripheral. And the second point is that many of the well-known cases of private sector actors engaging in peace-building processes, they don't actually involve companies per se. Instead, they involve either prominent business people, such as CEOs acting in their capacity as individuals rather than as representatives of the company, or they involve third-party entities such as foundations or other initiatives that are set up by companies but exist entirely outside of the governance structure of any company.